Hello, this is Her Majesty Queen Mother, Dòwòti Desir, Hounon, Houna II, Guely. I'm speaking to you from Lomé in Togo. I observe all protocols as I thank and acknowledge those who invited me to the Abolish Slavery National Network quarterly meeting, especially Max and Kamal, but also fellow speakers, legislators, committed activists, and audience members. As a 4,000-year-old phenomenon, slavery is as old as human existence. Globally, there are around 46 million human beings enslaved. And it's important to recognize that they are enslaved and not simply slaves, which not only contributes to their dehumanization, but also fails to recognize that all human beings are born free. My remarks come from an international perspective, which supports the arguments being made today that view penal servitude as a new incarnation of slavery. The International Labor Office, which I consulted 4 years ago, has data that notes that within this number, this 46 million, we have 22% of today's enslaved population in the sex industry. Recognizing the number of those enslaved in penal systems is a more complex and messy political determination to make. According to another organization, Free the Slaves, slavery generates $150 billion. $150 billion. In the United States of America alone, it generates at least $74 billion. And that's more than the gross domestic product of most African countries. Again, what percentage makes up the penal population globally is uncertain. I share this information as a means of providing context to the ensuing conversation around abolition. Abolitionists are people who favor the abolition of any law or practice deemed harmful to society. And I want to note that there are abolitionists working in Benin, in Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, elsewhere on the African continent, as well as in Europe, the Caribbean, and of course the United States, with every fiber of their being to put an end to this scourge. In the U.S., the 13th Amendment in particular is at the heart of the issue. African descendants in the U.S. make up 4% of the world's population, but 22% of its imprisoned population. Mass incarceration, excessive punishment, and the exploitation and gross consumption of social, political, and economic space of African descendants in particular is the essence of enslavement. Our intersectional approach to fighting racism has been the norm in fighting for victims in the human rights community. And while not always specifically referred to, the incarcerated community, like cast members, need to be aware of the international legal instruments that impact regional, national, and local laws. This information is not always disseminated as it should be, so vigilance is required. And because of the brevity of the time allotted, I want to refer largely to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which is the outcome document of the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, the WCAR, which took place in Durban, South Africa. In the very first section of the Durban Declaration, also known as the DDPA, following its introductory passages entitled Sources, Causes, Forms, and Contemporary Manifestations of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, it states in Article 25, we express our profound repudiation of the racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance that persists in some states, in the functioning of the penal systems and in the application of the laws, as well as the actions and attitudes of institutions and individuals responsible for the law enforcement, especially where this has contributed to certain groups being overrepresented among persons under detention or imprisoned. Article 29 expresses the following. We strongly condemn the fact that slavery and slavery-like practices still exist today in parts of the world and urge states to make immediate measures as a matter of priority to end such practices which constitute flagrant violations of human rights. And finally, Article 30, which concludes the section by stating, we affirm the urgent need to prevent, combat, and eliminate all forms of trafficking in the persons, in particular women and children, and recognize that victims of trafficking are particularly exposed to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Now, among the challenges that we face are the U.S.'s refusal to adhere to certain international conventions, including the DDPA, and the Convention to the Rights of the Child, which addresses racial discrimination, racism, and xenophobia, again, and other forms of intolerance, human trafficking, and enslavement, particularly as it relates to children. This is all done under the pretext of maintaining national autonomy, when in fact all international laws, conventions, treaties, and resolutions recognize the state's sovereignty. In this instance, government refuses to recognize the sovereignty of the individual to maintain their right and their dignity and humanity, even if incarcerated. The lack of adherence and the fragmentation of legislation relating to racial discrimination is an enormous challenge. The U.S. ratified and adheres to CERD, or the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racism, but not the DDPA. And this is an example of the kind of internal inconsistencies that leaves questions about the nature of the law, what it prohibits, its penalties, remedies, what reparations are. Thus, consolidation or creation of a consistent, coherent legal framework is called for in abolishing the laws against contemporary enslavement, especially among Afro-descendants, as this phenomena is related to the historic enslavement of Africans. The DDPA declared the enslavement of Africans as a crime against humanity which should have never occurred. And as an international advisor to the Abolish Slavery National Network, it is this most important endeavor that must be pursued. I ask that all of you participating and listening to this event to please familiarize yourself with the international moral mandate known as the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. It is available on the UN website at un.org. I thank you for your time and your consideration.